I'd like to start the program this morning with a word of prayer, and I'd like to call on Dr. Mary Nixon to start our day that way.
Good morning. Good morning to everyone. Please join me in prayer today. The prayer is a prayer taken from the Methodist Book of Daily Prayer. God of all people, you not only created all that is, but you sustain the whole with your love and grace. Today, prick our conscience and consciousness so that we are fully aware of those around us who are feeling alone and isolated, for those who are overlooked or ignored, for those who are having difficulty finding love. Words and conversations that also tear down others instead of building them up. As you extend a place for us to belong, help us to be the people who draws others in and creates a space for them. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. It is our joy to welcome our keynote speaker and panelist. Our keynote speaker is Reverend Neal Christie, who is a United Methodist elder. He leads the Religious Nationalism Project of the New York State Council of Churches and has served as Assistant General Secretary for Education and Leadership Formation with the General Board of Church and Society. In addition to his leadership and board membership for institutes worldwide, Reverend Christie has produced a 6-part series of study videos of the United Methodist Social Principles titled Living Our Principles. And he is an author on several resources through discipleship resources and Cokesbury Press, including Living as Haves and Have-Nots, Justice in Everyday Life, and Guidelines for Church and Society. Our panelists are Reverend Marianne Brown Trigg, who is an elder from the Horizon Texas Conference and serving as the executive director of the Denton Wesley Foundation, a campus ministry for students from the University of North Texas, Texas Women's University, and North Central Texas College. We have Reverend Cheryl Smith of the Texas Conference. She is also an elder in the United Methodist Church, retired. She has served under appointment in the Texas Annual Conference for 23 years. She's a licensed professional counselor, a certified teacher, serves on the Texas Annual Conference Committee for Church and Society, and has been teaching 3 classes so far in the new social principles. And Dr. Major Boglin serves as the Director of Diversity and Cultural Engagement for the Horizon Texas Conference, a role he began in August of 24. But since the early 2000s, he served as the Family Life Intercultural Development Minister for the North Atlanta Church of Christ and as the Executive Director of the Genesis Center for Christian Counseling in Dunwoody, Georgia. In these positions, he played a pivotal role in fostering multicultural and inclusive faith communities. Would like to welcome all of you to this. Some details. If you're familiar with Zoom, I would ask that you post your questions instead of the chat in the Q&A, which is the box right next to that. And we will either address those during the session, or I'll raise my hand for our speakers if there's something that maybe we need to ask them to move on to. And as you may see, this webinar is being recorded, and our conferences will work together to make sure that this recording is available to you. So glad to get started.
Thank you so much. Thank you, friends. I am going to do a share screen, and here we go. Move it to this. Please, tell me if we're good with it.
Neal, you just hit the
How's
button
that?
down. Yep. Perfect. That's
Better?
perfect. Thanks, Neal.
All right,
Perfect.
friends. Again, thank you. I want to say thank you to Kevin for the initial invitation to join you and to be part of this webinar. Grateful to each of you colleagues, siblings in Christ from each of these beautiful states in the United Methodist Church represented, and conferences represented, and a special blessing and prayer for all the saints, all the ancestors, all the mentors, the teachers, the people who have brought us to this space so far. This is All Saints Day. This is a time to remember today and tomorrow, to lift up those who live in glory, those who are the guide for us still, and who with Christ move us in the place of toward justice, toward discipleship, toward love, toward greater grace. And so with that in mind, I invite you into a conversation on the revised social principles. And I am happy to make this PowerPoint available to you, work with you in contextualizing it for each of your conferences, even local churches if you're interested. The goal is to get this information out to all United Methodists in your jurisdiction across Texas, and then nationally and globally, because this is a new document for really a new church, a church that is reforming itself even as we meet today. So I want to make sure you have my contact information. That is my cell phone at the top, my email address, my personal email address. If you have not ordered a hard copy of the social principles, you can order them from Cokesbury. And I think there's a bit of a backlog on them, but if you order, you can order them. I invite you to do that. You can also get them in e-form, which I didn't realize until a couple of days ago. So if you're interested in sort of an ebook, you can do that. The Social Principles video series that was mentioned, it's available on the Church and Society website. It's a bit dated, but the stories are not. Stories are stories. Stories are people's life experiences. So that's what's documented in that 6-part series. I encourage you to take a look at them. It doesn't correspond with each section of the social principles. That's for a new set of videos. God willing, at some point we'll do that. But I do think that these stories are powerful, and I really encourage you to take a look at them and adopt them as you will as you're teaching the social principles. And then the final resource here is Justice in Everyday Life. This was intended for laity. It was written for laity. It was revised a couple of times, and I'm in the process now of writing a new book for the upper room. It'll be a little bit longer, but it's still primarily for lay leadership. And it'll be sort of used for the course of study on the servant leaders course of study, but it'll hopefully have a broader audience as well. So that will be out in 2026. So just keep your eyes open for it. But you can, if you're interested in this, you can order it. Again, since it is All Saints Day, I want to share this quote. This was meaningful for me in my meditation yesterday. Walking, waiting, I am listening to a deeper way. Suddenly, all of my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say. Watch, listen. You are the result of thousands. I share this with you because the social principles really are the result of thousands. This document, the language, the words, the intentions, the values, the interests represented in the social principles really are, we are the product of that vision for a social gospel, a liberating gospel that was continuing to perfect itself through the social principles. Now, whether we're conscious of it or not, the United Methodist Church has been influenced by the social principles. We may never have read them. Many in our congregations may be familiar with something around social teaching in the United Methodist tradition, but they have guided our church. They've done this in a formal and informal way. And so today we want to talk about both both ways that they work. The formal way, the formal level, and then the informal relational level where we spend most of our times as in discipleship and growing our faith in the world. Want to remind you that this has always been a Wesleyan commitment to speaking to the issues of our day, recognizing that we come from a larger tradition. I like to remind people of this theological concept. I started doing this when I was teaching in the United Methodist Seminary in Moscow because they were new to the United Methodist Church. That in the United Methodist Church, we affirm that God's grace is available to all, but that John Wesley talked about different forms of grace, right? He talked about the grace that comes before we even make a decision to follow God, to accept Christ into our lives. That's prevenient grace. For me, when I look at the social principles, I see this in that first section of the social principles, the community of all creation, that even before I'm conscious of it, the universe, God's earth, God's air, God's water, God's soil is showing me who God is, that is inviting me into relationship, inviting us into relationship, so that grace is there before we even are aware of God's grace and presence in our lives. That's the first sort of the movement. The second is we start to make decisions on how we're going to respond to grace, that justifying grace, if you will. And I think that the two previous sections to the social principles, the nurturing community and the social community that have now become the social community, that they really reflect this notion of grace, that we say yes to each other, we say yes to community, we define who we are in community, we look at language around rights, responsibilities, we move from human dignity that is affirmed in the community of all creation to human rights, human responsibilities. What is our responsibility? How are we to be in community together? There's a third piece here, a theological piece I just want to lift up, and it's sanctifying grace. This is particular to, in the Protestant traditions, it's particular to Wesleyan theology. United Methodists celebrate sanctifying grace, that God is not finished with us yet. God is continuing to form us. So what does it mean to create a more holy, a sanctified social holiness, the language that Wesley used, movement in the world today? Well, I look at the economic community and I think about sanctifying grace. How do we order ourselves with the resources that we have available to really continue going beyond the language of rights and responsibilities to sustainability? How do we sustain healthy livelihoods with one another? How do we sustain the earth together, given the resources we have? And then the final piece in Wesleyan theology is something called perfecting grace. We don't talk about this very much in the United Methodist Church anymore, but John Wesley believed that we could become perfect in love in this world. Not perfect as human beings, but perfect in the sense that we are guided, our decisions are guided by a love of God, a love of neighbor, and a care for self. Well, what does it mean to really be guided by that perfecting grace? The vision in the social principles, I think, from the very beginning, was to really have that sense in a world order, that we would be one world community. We could relate to one another, that there would be an alternative to violence, there would be an alternative to conflict. And so the political and world community are not affirming what we hear in oftentimes in political theory of real politics or realpolitik. There's more a sense of what's God's best notion, God's best vision for beloved community that goes beyond borders. What does it mean for us to live in a larger world community together? How do we get to that love? How do we get to that love? And when we look at this section, you'll even notice it, that the choice of Wesleyan quotes reflects this desire for love, greater love, ordering our political relationships, ordering our national relationships across the border. So I offer this to you as one way of approaching the social principles through the lens of grace that is particular to our United Methodist tradition. All right, I want to remind you that this is not something that was created in a vacuum, that the first social principles began with the 1908 Social Creed, reflecting the Wesleyan commitment to social holiness. This was the first creed of any Protestant church. This was also the beginning. This precedes Catholic social teaching by about 20, 30 years. This was at the first round of what was called the social gospel movement in the United States. And you'll see in the language, if you haven't looked at it more recently, let's talk about Texas before we go right into it. You'll see you'll see how it was trying to respond to the realities of the time. What was happening in Texas? I did a little bit of research. In Texas, there were political and economic movements happening. I'm not going to read it all to you. You can see this for yourself, some of the highlights that I saw when I looked this up online. What struck me was that the governor was focusing on more progressive reforms in the state, that UT Austin is now building out its education and research arms, that railroads were starting to be built across the state of Texas, laying the ground for infrastructure, that racial segregation, of course, was still the norm, reflected broader national trends, but the labor movement was gaining traction. And the labor movement was happening both in agriculture and in industry. I thought that was interesting. Be interesting to know in your own communities what was happening in Arkansas or Texas, or other states that are conferences that are represented on this webinar. What was happening? What was happening in this turn of the century? And if you were to write a social creed, what would you include given the social indicators in your own context? So here's the 1908 Social Creed. Again, we were not the United Methodist Church yet. That wouldn't happen until 1968 to 72. But the Methodist Episcopal Church, this was the first social creed. Notice the language that's here. Majority of it has to do with economic justice. We were dealing with child labor. We were dealing with advocating for the rights of women to vote. Native Americans at this time did not have the right to vote. That didn't happen until two decades later. But women, we were arguing for the right to vote. End of child labor. Ending sweatshop systems. The language of sweatshops, the sweating system was already part of the lexicon. The Methodist Church was the church that argued for release from employment 1 day in 7. So getting the work week established as a norm nationally. Language of living wage. We introduced that into the lexicon. Notice what's not in this social creed. You notice it doesn't begin with any Trinitarian affirmation. There's no God talk at the beginning. And even at the end, the affirmation is the golden rule of the mind of Christ. So something that generally in a Christian majority nation at the time, we could all pretty much affirm, right? But this was our first social creed. Notice what's in here. Notice what's not in here. Consider for yourselves what you would include in a social creed, and we'll go forward. This is our current social creed. It has not been amended. Last time it was amended was 2016. It's a fairly stable creed. Notice at the end in our book of discipline that we invite congregations to make it available and to emphasize it regularly in every congregation. I'm wondering, friends, how often you've seen in the liturgy portions of the social creed used. You may not have the social principles in your pews. I did that when I was serving a local church. When there was a wedding, the chair of trustees would remind me, Neal, we need to order more social principles, because all different faiths, would take our social principles at the end of the wedding. They pull them from the pews and they take them on home. But how often do we have in our local churches the social creed posted somewhere? Not too many. I know a couple of churches in the Philippines and in Africa that do it. I know the Methodist Church in Mexico, which is an autonomous church, they have been using it. But I don't know how many United Methodist churches use it on a regular basis. Notice the language here. It begins with, there's a couple of things that are quite different and that are sustained in the new social principles. First, the language of we. We. In our previous social principles, we didn't really define what we meant by we. In the creed, it's obvious what we mean by we. We're saying this is the people who are gathered out of faith, who identify as United Methodists. So we have a Trinitarian affirmation at the beginning. We then affirm what correspond with each section of the social principles. We affirm the natural world. We don't use the language of community of all creations here because this precedes the new document, but we affirm the natural world. We affirm the blessings of community. We then get into language of rights, and we name categories of rights based on people groups. Then we get into the duty of all persons to work, the dignity of work, the necessity of work, the good of work. Then we get into peace, and we get into the final, that notion that God is ultimately not finished with us yet, that God has an end, a good end for us, for humanity and for creation. So the creed will reflect each section of the social principles, even though the language is slightly different than what we have in our new document. But I do encourage you to, if you're teaching the social principles, to begin with the creed, to invite people, again, where do you see in your community that we're living out in ministry and discipleship portions of this creed? Where can this creed sort of emphasize the particular ministries and missions that we have commitments to? How can they live in conversation with each other? All right, 2004 to 2008, and this is important for our new social principles. There was a call from the United Methodist Church in Germany to create a new social creed that would be presented to the General Conference on the anniversary of the Social Creed. So in 2008, 100 years after the Social Creed was written, we went through a 4-year process of listening and writing, and it was the first time that any agency of the United Methodist Church went through this process. It was not written by a board. It was written with input from our siblings in the Philippines, parts of Africa, parts of Europe, the United States. And then it was reconciled. It was reconciled by the Board of Church and Society. The decision was to make it into more of a litany, something that could be more useful in a local church setting. So we have if you have not seen this recently, the companion litany to the Social Creed was developed, and it was approved, and it was adopted by the General Conference overwhelmingly. And notice the language is different. It's more poetic. It still follows the structure of the current social principles, but it's inviting. It's intended to be adapted, put to music. Some of you may be familiar with the music of Mark Miller. Mark Miller is a friend of mine. We are both from the same home conference. We used to teach youth camp together when we were both younger. And Mark actually put this to music at one point. If anyone's interested in the setting that he has, I'm happy to send it to you. But I do invite you to become more familiar with this social creed, the litany, as we look at the new social principles. Okay. A little more history, and then we'll go right into the document. In 68 to 72, there was a social principles study commission created, and to bring recommendations for new social principles back to the 72 General Conference. Fast forward 50 years, there began an 8-year process, really a 12-year journey. In 2012, the General Conference called for church and society to engage in the process of considering, not even making the decision to rewrite them, but considering to revise the social principles. And it had 3 goals. Number 1, to make them more succinct. What we found was that this document was becoming more unwieldy. Every General Conference, a new principle was added. Certain principles were extended. The language on human sexuality, for example, continued to get longer and longer. Language on reproductive health became longer and longer. Pieces on another section that became quite large, I think, and a bit unwieldy, was language on economic justice. There were sections there which applied to the US, but they really didn't apply outside the United States. And they didn't work in Europe, and they didn't work in Africa. So how do we make them more succinct? And then how do we make them more theologically grounded? The greatest critique I would hear from seminary professors and from college professors, as well as a lot of clergy, is how do I teach this? Where's the theology here? And so that was a great concern, even as before we began the writing process. And then how do you make them globally relevant? So now the United Methodist Church, when we look at the United Methodist Church in 2019 General Conference, and then you look at 2024 General Conference, the significant number, the growth of the United Methodist Church in the global South, and how that's represented at General Conference, it's significant. So how do we make these social principles globally relevant, whether we are living in Texas or Arkansas, other states, if we're living here speaking to the world, or if we're living in other nations speaking from their perspective to those of us who are living in the United States? How do we understand that one person's global is another person's local, and another person's local is another one's global? How do we understand that? How do you reflect that in this document? So that was a priority from 2012 going forward. In 2016, we took what we heard, we brought it back to the General Conference. They approved us to do the work of revising the document. We began, of course, by hosting listening sessions, and then we began with the writing sessions, okay, to make it more worldwide, theologically grounded, and succinct. And we found that this was a deeply United Methodist experience. It reflected the diversity of United Methodists living within these different regions. The numbers, of course, now have changed in 2016, but it gives you a sense of the enormity, right? How do you create a document for this size church? Okay, 2016, we had our marching orders. 2017, we created 6 writing teams that drafted the first draft of the new social principles, 52 participants, 5 jurisdictions, 6 central conferences involved, over 4,000 United Methodists offered feedback online. They held listening sessions. I'll show you a graph in just a moment that shows where the majority of those listening sessions were held. And their comments came back. Another draft was written. The draft was released in 4 languages. More responses came back, over 2,500 responses online, 2,000 participants in public conversation. Before the 2019 General Conference, the General Board of Church and Society, the board members then gave their input. They held off until they had heard from really the worldwide church. They put their fingerprints on the document. And it was after the 2019 General Conference that new language on child marriage, on human sexuality, on marriage was introduced. And that was then submitted to what would have been the 2020 General Conference, which became the 2024 General Conference. All right, this gives you a sense of the team members that did the writing. And here's the structure. All right, so we have a new preface in the social principles that provides us with a history of the denomination, a recognition of our predecessor bodies, the EUB, Evangelical United Brethren Church, for example, and then also the contributions that come from the central jurisdictions. Remember, the United Methodist Church had been a segregated church, a formally segregated church. We're still dealing with segregation in multiple forms, whether it's racial or economic forms, but there it was a very, very different structure. So we want to recognize this in the history of in our preface. The preamble, I think, is a beautiful standalone, if you will, and it's a piece that I would encourage classes, sermons, have it placed in places in our churches, because it really draws out what theologically we would call salvation history. How is it that God created humanity and then moved us into covenant with God and with one another? What does it look like when we've broken the covenant? What does it mean when we live with our differences? And how can we still accept one another, not in spite of our differences, but recognizing those differences will exist and that God still is not finished with us yet? The new structure is this: the community of all creation, the social community, the economic community, and the political community. So we have now taken out what was previously called the nurturing community. It's become part of the social community. The economic community includes parts of what were in the political and world community, and there is no world community. Now you may wonder, well, why is there no world community? Don't we live in a world community? We of course live in a world community, but we live in one world. We live in one political community. It's not a political community for the United States and then a world community for the rest of the world. No, we're one United Methodist Church. So how do we create a section in the social principles that reflects the United Methodist Church living in political community together? Again, this shows you the states that are represented in the work, that of comments that came back to revise the document in the first and second drafts. You'll notice that there are places here that are not United Methodist. Armenia, we don't have United Methodist. Venezuela, we do have missional churches in Vietnam, for example. United Kingdom, interesting that the British Methodist Church was very eager to comment on this document. Some others, Kyrgyzstan, which is part of Eurasia. They have a seminary there. I've taught there. They were very interested in contributing. Ivory Coast at one point was the largest of the conferences in Africa. It's now become an autonomous church after 2024. Germany, very interested in this document. In fact, it was back in, just as a piece of history, it's not reflected in that PowerPoint, back in 2004, even before the Social Creed was revised, Bishop Henrik Bolliter, meeting in Germany, said from an ecumenical perspective, as we are working with churches outside the UMC tradition, we need to have a document that will speak to who we are, our values, our theology, our social commitments. So there was a desire, and it was coming from outside the United States, to revise this document. And that was happening 8 years before the General Conference took it seriously and said, do the work. So this shows you also some of the gatherings that we held. We invited conferences to comment on the first draft. Some commented on the second draft. They did that online, but a lot of this was done face-to-face. So you see some of the conferences that are represented and local churches that are represented here. I'm grateful to every one of them that took time to do this. It was a blessing in many of these cases to sit with churches in their basements, their parlors, their sanctuaries as we discussed the draft. Okay, so you see the numbers reflected. And we didn't just invite conferences to do this and church and society folk and lay leadership to do this. We took this to schools. So you'll see the different, and the caucuses as well. We were very blessed to have this. United Women in Faith, previously called United Methodist Women, they held special listening sessions. Each of the agencies, including WestPath, the pension entity for the United Methodist Church, held conversations on this document. Okay. This gives you a sense of the conferences and the breadth of conferences involved. And then the final product, as I've said again, we believe it's teachable. It's useful for public decision makers. I live in Washington, D.C. I work on Capitol Hill. I work with many organizations focusing right now on economic justice, on immigration. I always bring up the United Methodist Social Principles when I speak to our legislators. Sunday school classes, it's a blessing to be able to teach them. Some of the main changes here I want to lift up for you. Now, I apologize, the pagination's not going to work with what you may have if you have the hard copy. I'm working off of my my previous copy, which was produced by Church and Society. But the first change that's significant, I want to walk you through these, is to the destruction of ecosystems. This is a new social principle, a new social principle. And second is the agency of indigenous peoples. We have a new social principle that addresses why more attention needs to be given to indigenous peoples, not just in the United States, but globally. New language on sustainability. You'll see new social principle on environmental racism. Now, that section had been quite large, but we had really neglected looking at the impact of environmental racism on vulnerable communities. And then new language on affirming science and traditional wisdom. This came from the Native American Caucus of the United Methodist Church, which will actually be meeting in Albuquerque in New Mexico. And I'll be there in another week. This was really important. How do we balance our traditional empirical Western dominant understanding of science with traditional ways within the church? and how do we not neglect these marginal voices? That was a priority across the board for the document. You'll see in the economic community, these are the 4 changes that are significant. One is on globalization and the impact of globalization. The second is on poverty and income inequality. This is one of my favorite in the entire document. Why? I have fond memories of talking to students at Perkins and also at Duke Divinity School, and they're getting really excited about this social principle because it critiques the prosperity gospel. And just listening to these students talk about what it's like going into churches where people truly, they bought into this notion that God has blessed me with the income that I have, that a theology that's antithetical to where these students are called to be in ministry. And they were so grateful that we are naming it, that poverty and income inequality, it is not something blessed by God, that this is a social construct. And so let's name it. Let's talk about what the values we affirm are as United Methodists. The next one that I'm grateful for is human trafficking and slavery. Since 68-72, we have had a very strong social principle on slavery, but we have not addressed human trafficking. So it was, again, students several years ago, I remember coming to me saying, Neal, why do we not talk about human trafficking? Other churches are talking about this. Why is it not in our social principles? So now we have a very strong social principle addressing human trafficking, what it is, its impact, what we can do. And then Sabbath and renewal time. You would think, well, how can that be controversial? That was controversial. How do you, and you'll see when you read that social principle, it's different from our previous social principles. How do we honor time and Sabbath? What does that look like for people who are working more than a 40-hour work week, right? What does it mean when people are underemployed? So these have consequences. Each of these social principles have particular consequences. So there were a lot of new additions here in this section. Now, social community, this includes the language on human rights, responsibilities. We don't use the word obligations. Part of me, this is my own personal opinion, I like the language of obligation. What is my obligation to you? How are we responsible to each other? But we do limit ourselves to language of human rights and human responsibilities. In the previous social principles, we said God's gift to us, to humanity, is human rights. Our gift to one another is, God's gift to humanity is human dignity. Our gift to one another is human rights. So that is really reflected in the new document. So you'll see the language that is changed here. The most, I think, the one that really has defined the conversation has been our new language on human sexuality. When you read it, you will notice that we have taken out any language around incompatibility, any hateful language around incompatibility, especially in this social principle. But you'll notice that in the whole document, there is no language around incompatibility. There is nothing saying incompatible with the gospel or incompatible with the Christian teaching or incompatible with Christian tradition. So the language on human sexuality, which was finalized after the 2019 General Conference, which had full buy-in from Africa, the Philippines, and Europe, as well as the US. It was unanimous, utterly unanimous. There were no objections to General Conference in passing this. This is the new language on human sexuality. Marriage, it's very similar. The only change here is a both and to reflect some of the legal realities in countries outside the United States. But the language that was presented to General Conference passed fully. It was just added to with one addendum. Child marriage, entirely new. You may wonder, why do we talk about child marriage? Well, because it's a reality outside the United States. The bishops of the United Methodist Church in Africa, deeply concerned about child marriage. Polygamy, same thing. Polygamy is still practiced in the United Methodist Church, although there are conditions for it in some books of discipline right now. Just some history for you, some context. If you are in a polygamous marriage, if you are the second wife, you may not join as a full member of the church. You may not your children may not be able to take communion in a United Methodist Church. So there is a caste system implicitly built into polygamous systems. Some would lift up the benefits in some social contexts, but we also know the deficits to children and to women and the power differential. So it was important, if not urgent, to include this in our new social principles. Language on colonialism, neo-colonialism, and consequences. This is adapted. We had some of this, but it's more expansive. Gender equity and diversity. It's a bit more inclusive. It reflects our language on human sexuality and marriage. Racism, ethnocentrism, and tribalism. It's not new, but there's an addition, and it's more succinct. Tribalism is a reality in the United States, in the United Methodist Church, if not in the United States. And so we had to address what do we say about tribalism? How do we approach it? In the political community, two main changes. One on military service and war. You won't find incompatibility language there. It's a more nuanced statement. I'd be interested to hear comments on that for those of you that have digested it. And then language on Indigenous, Native, and Aboriginal communities. All right. Some links there for you. And then a review here for you. Again, in the preamble, this is some of the language that's lifted up. This is why I'm so excited about it. I think it's affirming the best of our tradition, affirmation of the triune God, that we are made in the image of God. We are intended to live in covenant with one another. We extend that covenant through the love ethic that Jesus affirmed, that appears in Deuteronomy and is re-articulated by the prophets. It's about relationship. It's about sanctifying love. We are also, we are made for goodness. We are made, intended to be, we are made with God's best intentions for us. And yet we have different parts and different responsibilities. And so difference ought not to be seen as a deficit, but as a gift, as a real opportunity. So how do we live with our differences? And then there's the affirmation of the universal church, and an affirmation that conflict does occur. And how do we navigate conflict? The importance of navigating conflict. This is very, very, very different than our previous preamble. So I would encourage us, with the time that, before we move into the panel discussion, to consider a few ways that we may want to teach this material. If you are interested, I am very willing to come and work with your conferences to do interactive workshops for leaders, train the trainer workshops. But these are some of the things I would encourage you to do, you could do now, is to take each section of the social principles and use some modality, a different style of teaching, if you will. For the community of all creation, you could use the agree-disagree model, something that we've been doing for many, many years. I did this at Church and Society. My colleagues did it. Do you agree with it? Why do you agree with it? Why do you disagree with it? Where do you witness in your church neighborhood, the neighborhood where you live, work, and play, this social principle coming to life? Where do you see community of all creation relevant for you? How do we ritualize it? We're a ritualizing people. This is why we gather for worship. This is why we begin and end with prayer. How do we remember through our repeated actions our care for creation? What difference could this make? How do we take the social principle and then actually kind of put a pattern to it in our worship together, in our actions together? So this is one example of way you may want to consider teaching around the social principles. Another is role play. I like to do this. Sometimes what I'll do is invite a group to sit around a table, and I'll invite people to take on a different role, a different character. And so let's read one section of the economic community. What does it say about labor? What does it say about living wage? What does it say about immigration? And then to take on a role. What does that social principle look like, sound like, feel like from the perspective of a worker? What about someone who owns, someone who's an owner, an investor, a stakeholder in a company, or a consumer, someone who is on the receiving end of the goods? And then what does it look like from the perspective of God's creation that is animate, that is alive? Consider, and I would invite you to do this with every section of the social principles, but the economic community can appear a bit more abstract. So how do we bring it home? And for me, the way to do it is to sort of really adopt a character, to see myself in the role, in the economic systems that we participate in. So this is one way that you may be able to teach this, to practice it with a group. And then there's another exercise I enjoyed doing. Some of you have worked with me, have seen us do this. We'll create two circles, an inner circle and an outer circle, or you pair people up and you invite them to speak from their own experience. How does this social principle impact me? We have a very strong language on single people, the humanity, the dignity, the worth of single people. Again, human sexuality, marriage, child marriage, polygamy, divorce. The language on divorce has changed slightly, but it's pretty consistent with previous versions of social principles. Substance abuse, euthanasia, and suicide. This has been changed slightly, but it's consistent with what we've been teaching for several decades. And then the language on racism, ethnocentrism, and tribalism. But how does this impact me? And to ask one person to listen, one person to speak from their own experience, and to do it in an uninterrupted way, so that people have an opportunity to really be heard and also to be able to speak in their own voice. I think there's a real sacredness in allowing for that space to happen. And then for pairs to switch. So if two people are talking with one another in a circle, you ask them to find another partner and they continue this conversation. Again, I'm happy to coach you through how you may want to do this in your own contexts. All right, a couple of final thoughts. As we look at each of these social principles, I invite you to consider that they reflect four things. First, they definitely are a position of the United Methodist Church. This is where the United Methodist Church stands, that we will always speak for the United Methodist Church. Doesn't mean we have to agree with it. There are social principles I have some disagreement with, but I took a vow in my ordination to teach them, and I do. So what's the position of the church? They are a legislated document. They are legislated positions of the church. They're useful and should be used publicly, but they're not just positions of the church. If you go a little bit deeper, you'll notice they represent different interest groups. I like the Latin word, inter esse, to be among. So who are we among? Who do we associate with? Whose interests do we represent? Are those interests competing, or are they complementary? Well, each social principle is a result of a mediated, negotiated interests, if you will. And we come to some agreement. And that's what the social principle we have, at least for the next 4 years. So they represent particular interest groups. They may be, the examples of this could be, if you identify as a young person, a young adult, a young person, a woman, a man, a person with US citizenship versus another nationality citizenship, person living with disabilities, differently abled, clergy, laity, language groups, and income levels. These are all different interest groups that are mediated to get to the social principle we have. Under that, though, still are values. Each social principle reflects certain values. Look for the values. What are those values? What is the story that's being told? What's the biblical and theological values that it affirms? Which values does it not affirm? When I ask this question, frequently people say, well, hospitality, respect, love, tolerance. These are the positive values. Well, what are the negative values that we don't want to talk about? Are they reflected in any of these social principles? And if they are, how do we navigate around those? If they are positive values, then how do we lift them up in the context of our mission, ministry, and discipleship? And then finally, we may not always agree on some of these social principles, the positions we take. We may not agree with the different interest groups that we are competing with, negotiating with. Our values may even be slightly different, and that's okay too. But what are the common needs you and I have? When we don't agree on our values, interests, or positions, can we say that there are particular needs that are irreducible, that all people share? How does this social principle meet those needs? And I invite you to take a closer look to see that, yes, this meets those needs, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you have 2028. You can introduce a new social principle. All right. Just want to share this with you as I close out. I met with many of our new bishops before the General Conference, and I asked them these questions, sort of as an orientation, right, to the document. I would read a social principle, and then I'd ask them some questions. So I invite you to maybe consider creating this kind of a you could do this even you could do this on a Sunday morning, perhaps asking a question and asking a panel to respond. You may do this in Sunday school class. You may do this as a public meeting, but read a portion of a social principle and then ask the question. And the bishops had some really wonderful things to share about each of these new social principles. So, okay. And again, it's just giving you a sense of where some of the diversity of new principles that are out there. Okay, next steps. Where are opportunities for you to teach experientially the new social principles in 2025, going from 2025 into 2026 and 27, 2028? How does this mirror the priorities of discipleship ministries, your church and society boards, religion and race, status and role of women? Those are some questions I have for you. And before we turn it over for the panel discussion, consider ways that you would teach these social principles. Auditory, that we are listening people, but we're also visual people. We're tactile people. We live in our bodies. How do we engage the full self in the social principles, in studying them? And I would encourage us to remember that there is a difference between dialogue and debate. That the ideal, from my perspective at least, is that we ought to be in dialogue, serious, engagement with the social principles and one another. That's dialogue. The goal here is to listen, to understand, practice curiosity, to check in with ourselves, to acknowledge where power and privilege in the room is functioning, maintain healthy boundaries or to establish them. And debate, it's a little bit different, right? So some of us have done debate. We know that we're trying to really convince the other. The goal is to win at all costs. You know, and again, I hope that we approach this document and each specific social principles from a spirit of dialogue and not debate. I work with your U.S. members of Congress. That is part of what I do living in Washington, D.C. When I speak to staffers, and I'm blessed to be able to speak with members, I don't want a debate. I want a dialogue. I want to show United Methodist values at their best and why we care and why these are the positions we want legislation to go in. So whether it's a local church or whether it's Congress or the State House, I really encourage us to use this document as a resource, as a tool for dialogue. And as a closing, I would just invite us to remember again the companion litany to our social creed. And I'm just going to read the final line, and we will then turn it over to for our facilitated panel discussion. Today is the day God brings good news to the poor, proclaims release to the captives, gives sight to the blind, and sets the oppressed free. And so shall we. Amen. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I will turn it over to Dr. Bogman.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Reverend Christie, for the education, for the encouragement, for the invitation to learn from our social principles so that we can live into the vision of being followers of Jesus, seeking a loving and just and free world for all. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. It is a bit like drinking out of a fire hydrant, but hopefully there'll be other opportunities for us to digest the concepts, the precepts that you presented more fully. So I would just like to just invite the audience, if you'll keep putting your questions in the Q&A, then I'll pick from those, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in our time that we have left. First of all, what I'd like to do is, if our panelists, if I could get you to identify just one concept that just really stuck out for you as Reverend Christie was presenting, something that just really resonated, that you hope that we all got a good sense of. So just one thing. And if you need me to start, I can start. I'll start. I'm just going to say I am really fascinated with slides 5 and 39. I am fascinated with the way in which the connecting of the manifestations of grace to the social principles. That I just never have thought about that, and I'm sure most of you have, but I've not thought about that, and I'm fascinated to take another look into those in a bit more in depth. And then the other one was 39, the political community positions, values, interests, and needs that are embedded in the social principles, and being able to pull those out, articulate those, and help us to make sense of why we're doing what we're doing, and be able to connect these social principles back to and identify our values, identify our positionalities, our interest within, and our needs and the needs of others, our community, our neighbors, as we think about the social principles. So those are two things that just really jumped out to me. Yes, sure. Just jump in there.
I can share. One of the things that I wrote down to think about more is you were talking about what is global is local and what is local is global, and how for so often we've tried to like simplify a lot of social principles by being like, well, it's a global church, but then we do whatever we want here.
Right.
In my current context, I serve a lot of international students who like to come and FaceTime their families at the Wesley Center. And I'm thinking about how things that happen all over the world are also happening in the lobby of where I office every day, and vice versa. And how that is especially true for younger people. And thinking about how we can be more intentional about letting those things be as inextricably linked as they actually are.
I was struck by your statement, each social principle has consequences. I've been teaching classes, 3 of them. I'm just finishing them up. And I wish that I had woven that statement into my teaching more than I did, because it is so true. Each social principle, or the lack of a social principle, has consequences. And so if somebody is having trouble with a particular statement, or wondering where a particular stand comes from, I will, next time I get to teach this, I will weave that in a bit more. So what are the consequences of this social principle? What are the consequences if we don't speak on this social principle? As a way of helping people come to terms with the concept of consequences was an excellent insight for me.
Thank you. Yeah. It's interesting, because I think that we're so involved in ministry as a church that we do well to step back, right? And to take a pause and to go back and say, well, why do we do what we do? How are others approaching this issue? What does the church really want? I mean, I'd like to think the General Conference isn't just convened for every 4 years and legislate what the policy of the church will be. Just like annual conference is not just about policy, it's about who are we? You know, how do we live together? How are we living in the world together? And what am I missing? And you know, when I think about what my local church, the church I attend, does in terms of homeless outreach, you know, working with unhoused communities. Well, yeah, we're doing this, but what else are we missing? When I go back to the social principles, I think about work. You know, I think about dignity. I think about gender justice. I think about, okay, how are we affirming the whole understanding as United Methodist that there's not just one trajectory to respond, right? That there are multiple ways to approach this issue, and justice is not linear. Justice is holistic, and it's curious, and it's generative. And so when I look at the political community, for example, you know, I look at the section on criminal justice. I look at the section on civil disobedience, something that's happening across the country right now. I have clergy colleagues who have been arrested for praying in public spaces around ICE detention centers, and some governors ready to press charges against those colleagues. Well, I don't typically look at the social principle on civil disobedience, but I'm paying more attention to it now because the political climate we're in and the predilections of some of our legislators. I'm paying more attention. I used to not pay as much attention to, even though this is, I'm going to give you some confession here. I serve on the board of the Native American International Caucus. I'm not Native American, but I'm one of the two, along with Bishop Peggy Johnson, who serves on that caucus, and we'll be meeting in Albuquerque in a week. And I don't look typically at what the social principles say about our Native American siblings because I work on those issues with them on a week-to-week basis. I am paying more attention now in our political climate because indigenous peoples, their sovereignty and even their religious freedom is being threatened in many contexts. So I want to know what the United Methodist Social Principles have to say about indigenous peoples. I don't want it to just be about Neal Christie's opinion or my theology or my political persuasion or social persuasion. I really want to know, what does the United Methodist Church say? And I read the social principles on indigenous peoples differently now than I would have maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So when I go back to them, they start to shift. You know, we're living in very interesting times, aren't we? Right? Where we are challenged. We're socially and politically. How do we read these social principles with new eyes, given the context that we're in right now? I would love to know what folks who are participating today would say to that. You know, are there particular social principles for them that have greater resonance because of where we find ourselves in 2025?
Right. Yeah. No, thank you. Let me read one of these questions, and then and I'm guessing, Reverend Christie, this is probably for you. In always comparing new editions, I was wondering if the first one on page 5 was intended from the adoption of accepting all groups. You added communities to the word vulnerable in the Methodist movement. Is this in reference to acceptance of communities more so than individuals that so many felt years before? We always live in community and try to make the communities live together peacefully and accepting of one another.
So if I'm hearing the question, I'm hoping I'm hearing the question accurately, is welcoming of communities as well as welcoming of individuals. And I think in my comments, what I'm doing is putting more emphasis on welcoming communities. And if it's the question's in reference to the preface itself, the the preface language really tries to lift up the different communities that made up the United Methodist Church. Okay, so it's not talking about individuals as much, but the communities that we belong to as individuals. So, for example, in my version of the printed document, on page 5, it it begins with the affirmation that what Wesley was opposed to. Wesley was opposed to the slave trade, smuggling, the cruel treatment of prisoners. The EUB also condemns slavery. So we have individuals who participate in those systems, right? So we're talking about individuals, but these are systems here. Then it talks about the Methodist Episcopal Church North in particular. Then it talks about the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It's being quite honest that we've been a divided church, and yet we're trying to pull the very best of our value statements from each of our traditions here. Then it goes on to talk about the Evangelical United Brethren Church, which in 1946 had a whole different set of social principles. How do we reconcile their social principles with what would become the UMC set of social principles? And then the recognition that, especially, this is true, this is again a little history. I mean, since the 1990s and since 2000, the demographics of the UMC has significantly changed because the growth has happened across Africa. And these are fully United Methodist members in our church. This is not a tiered system that we have one person, one vote in the United Methodist Church to create our positions. So how do we respect those individual experiences, but also their collective history in the global South? That's such a different history than we've had in the United States, because these are former colonies. There are different economic systems, different political systems that are growing, but they're in relationship with one another, with us. So the Philippines, another example. Philippines has a deep and rich history at the United Methodist Church, going back well over 125 years. Some of the oldest United Methodist churches will be found in the Philippines. Well, how do we take what's best of their tradition and their community, and how is it informed in this document? So that's why the we is so important. Some people, I didn't think it was important at the beginning, but Dr. Randall Miller, who was the chair of the task force for the revision of the social principles, really found it important for us to pay attention to what do we mean by we? Who is the we? Is it collections of individuals? Is it groups? Is it historical groups? Is it strands of the church with all our different beautiful tapestry of histories? Who are the we? Well, now we come together as we. And this document reflects, with all our differences and all our history, it reflects the we. It reflects the we. So that section is when I'm referencing different groups, I'm really referencing groups we belong to, not individuals. My hope is that we do practice hospitality. The social principles lean into hospitality, welcome, respect for all people. That's where we're moving toward, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on human sexuality, whether it's on income differential, whether it's on nationality, that we are a hospitable church for individuals. But that preface is talking about the groups that we belong to.
Good, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go ahead and ask this question, and just ask it at large, because I want to get to it. I want us to get to it and make sure we don't leave this one out. That shows some bias on me, I'm sure. So I own that. Are you worried that highlighting the social principles will refocus on the divisions that split the Methodist Church?
I would love to hear what others say about that.
I worry about a lot of things, and that is not really one of them. I worry that refusing to tell the truth and own the social principles as part of our culture will create more divisions among us because like we're not being honest with people about how we discern what God's grace wants to do in the world. And then they come to join us and feel hurt or betrayed when we're discerning that differently than they expected we would. So I think highlighting the social principles is a way that we actually invite people into a more united church rather than invite people to dwell on divisions.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Others want to comment on that?
I find that since disaffiliation, which affected us in Texas dramatically,
Hmm.
across conferences, prior to disaffiliation, we were so focused on trying to hold things together that we couldn't even talk about the social principles. It was like setting off dynamite. And so most clergy kind of backed away from that a little bit. Not that we didn't read them ourselves, not that we didn't like them, not that we didn't want to talk about them, but the focus was on trying to hold us together. And so it was one of those topics that we couldn't delve in too deeply. Since disaffiliation, I personally am finding it a lot easier to talk about because many of the people who could not, would not bear the discussion are gone. And that is a loss to mourn in and of itself. But the remnant that is left, it feels safer to have these discussions now. Hence, you know, I've even in a retired position, I've been able to teach classes in the social principles and handle discussion and you know, without any fear that, you know, half the church is going to leave just because we're having a discussion. I welcome that. I'm sorry for the loss that we had to get us to this safer place. But in my experience, we are in a safer place.
Reverend Christie, before I move on, you want to
I didn't read this section from the preamble, but I want to read just a couple of these lines and to see if it's helpful. So it says, we acknowledge that the church is a living body gathered from the many and diverse parts of the human community. So we recognize our diversity. Thus, unanimity of belief, opinion, and practice, they have never been characteristic of the church from the beginning. I think it's important for us to recognize that. We tend to think that conflict is unhealthy or unwanted or something to be avoided, but it's been a reality since the very beginning. It's acknowledging that. There's the reference to the Gospels, Paul's letters, the Acts of the Apostles, the New Testament text. Diverse understandings and controversies on these matters have been reality. Therefore, whenever significant differences of opinion occur among Christians, some of which continue to divide the church deeply today, faithful Christians need to face their disagreements, and even their despair, right? And not cover differences with false claims of consensus or unanimity. On the contrary, the church needs to embrace conflict with courage and perseverance as we seek to discern what God's will is. And with that understanding and commitment, we pledge to ourselves to acknowledge and embrace with courage, trust, and hope those controversies that continue to arise among us, accepting them as evidence that God is not yet finished in sculpting us to be God's people. So it's a recommitment. I think we have an opportunity to recommit not to agreement, but acceptance and serious dialogue with one another. And there are so many issues affecting our local churches whether it's economic justice, economic justice, immigration, gender justice, access to health care, environmental crises. This is happening in every community. I see it across the board. I don't care every country I go to, everywhere I'm blessed to be able to work in, we deal with these issues. And so we're not going to agree with always on the strategies, the best strategies, or the best tactics, but we have to agree that there's a problem, that there's a challenge, and not run from it, and see that as an opportunity, and to know that we're not the first and we're not alone. This has been the case as Christians, and we're invited into this. This is what we're called to. So I'm not worried about division as much. I want to keep people at the table as long as they're willing to stay. I work with congregations dealing with entrenched conflict. That's something I do in this conference. And even when I disagree with a perspective, I really, really hope people will stay at the table so that we can work to a place that's healthy for all. We may not agree, but we can come up with some alternatives that we may not have come up with if it's just one group, right? All in agreement. When we're in disagreement, we can come up with something that may benefit all of us, and we'll find a way to stretch ourselves to be there. So I don't want to compromise on justice. I don't want to compromise on equity. I don't want to compromise on safety, but safety is not the same as security for me. I want people to belong, and it takes work to do that. It doesn't happen easily. It doesn't happen easily. And we may agree on so many issues, but we may disagree on this one issue. And can we still come to the table together, right? So,
yeah. Let me punctuate this question and the responses with Paul's admonition in Philippians chapter 3, start verse 15. Therefore, let us who are mature think this way, and if you think differently about anything, God will reveal this to you also. All right. So let's stay in the conversation together. Let's stay in the room, stay in the space, embrace the discomfort, and be respectful of each other and valuing each other's perspective as we move forward. Here's another question. Are there any tools for communicating / reinforcing these principles to youth in a way that is engaging and exciting?
I think so. Each of these, I would encourage you, if you look at the Justice in Everyday Life book, all of there are exercises that are written there. In the new Social Principles published by Cokesbury, there's a teaching section that it can be used with young people, with youth. Keep it dialogical, keep it tactile, keep it visual, right? Use what best communicates with them and with your community and how they communicate. But movement. When I work with young people, I don't have them sit. I have us physically moving. So I'll do 3 exercises, for example, with youth that some adults don't. If they want to sit down, they don't like what I'm going to be doing here, but youth typically like it. I'll do an agree disagree where I'll have people stand in the center of the room. I'll have them move into different positions. I'll ask them to notice who stands with them and notice who does not. What does it feel like to be on different sides of the line on an issue? What would make it possible for them to move or to shift? How did they get to where they are? Ask them their story. So same thing, I'll ask people to actually put to music, spoken word. I've had social principles taken where young people they've created spoken word around some of these social principles. Really creative stuff. Poetry, visual arts. Just engage the whole sense of self with young people and allow them to tell their stories. I have a memory of one social principle I come back to frequently, actually, where it was a social principle on suicide. And these were kids in a confirmation class. When I was talking to 12, 13-year-olds about suicide, I asked them, how many of them have known somebody who's even thought of taking their life or had a family member who made that decision? And to see these young people openly talk about this brought me to tears, because this is what's happening in our churches. This is what the kids are they're thinking. They've lived through. And so there are many social principles that on first thought, I wonder, how am I going to approach this? Well, I ask if I'm straight with them, if I'm honest with them, candid, they're going to be honest with me. They're going to tell me what they think. So college students, it's a different deal. I think for college students, all the social principles have worked with me when I ask them to really dialogue deeply with them. But a little bit younger, I have to actually try to get people to physically move so that it's not just verbalizing it, but they're living it out in their body. They're taking these social principles and moving with them. Yeah.
I have one example, and if anybody is working with youth right now and wants like details on some ways we've taught this, you can email me on the Denton Wesley website. And Kylie Campbell, one of your conference lay leaders, is like a youth ministry genius. And so that would be a great resource too.
Right.
But one of the games we play is four corners when talking about the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And then each corner is a different point on the quadrilateral. And I'll say something that starts with like, why is the church carpet red, right? Then moves into things more consequential, and then include like our social principles at the end, and have students go to the corner where they think is the reason that the church has decided this, right? Like, is it because it just makes sense, or is it because that's what the Bible says? And to watch them debate back and forth, well, the Bible says this, but that doesn't make sense, is a good way for them to be able to move around and also like experience these things in a way where they don't have to agree or disagree if it's not something they know about that well, but they do get to engage with and learn a little bit about how we come to some of these things too.
It's great. Great illustration.
I'd like to pose a question on a somewhat larger scale, not with a confirmation group or not with a class of people in a classroom, but in our annual conference, the Church and Society Committee decided that we wanted to work to have an emphasis on the social principles included in our annual conference meeting. And it seemed like a really great idea when we sat in a room with church and society members and we all went, yeah, that's a great idea. But it's a little bit like eating the elephant. It's huge. Don't quite know all the steps to bring this about. And so, Neal, I'm asking you, because you have experience across a wide span, how have you seen an annual conference weave the social principles into the fabric of our once a year meeting? Or have you seen that at all?
Seen it then, yeah. It's been a while. You mean for annual conference, right? So
Right.
I think it certainly can be done, where during the course of 3 days, how many of your days your annual conference session is, you could work from. I've not seen it done where the whole annual conference adopts that as sort of a foci. I have seen it with workshops. So I've seen it with different angles to the social principles. So for example, how to talk about difference. How do we live with our differences? But the social principles are the focus. So there'll be more than one workshop offered. And I've seen it more in leadership days than during annual conference sessions, but I have seen it at annual conference. I have seen it with invitations to speak to the body, the plenary, to do it during Bible study section. Every annual conference has a Bible study leader. I've done that before, and I'm sure one of my other colleagues have done it. I know I've done it. I think my general secretary, Jim Winkler, has done it, and then Susan Henry Crow did it. But that's a way to weave it in, is through the Bible study time, leadership development outside of annual conference. Lunches, church and society lunches are always challenging because you have such small amount of time. It's not as dialogical. I'm blessed because I've participated with discipleship resources, with discipleship to do the servant leadership course of study, and the advanced course of study is on the social principles. So in several conferences, giving them the tools they need to be able to interpret the social principles. But again, that's not during annual conference. But I could see it during an annual conference, right? I could just see it sort of structured in there, is time, 3 different slots. We're going to be focusing on this, this, and this, and then making it relevant. Trying to now think, we were actually discussing this in the Western jurisdiction in the Pacific Northwest for annual conference in 2025. It didn't work out, but they're looking at it now for 2026, where right before the annual conference session, there'd be a 1-day learning on the social principles, and then they would take some of those discussions and they would incorporate them into some of the work of the annual conference itself. But they would begin with a full day right before. And so I think we're looking at that model. I think that would be an interesting model, is before annual conference begins, invite people to dialogue around the social principles, do it in an interactive way, and then see how is this measure up with some of the work we're doing, whether it's finance or trustees or ordination or resolutions that are being considered. How does it measure? So there's some creative ways to brainstorm around this.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. And so one question, how can we as UMC members facilitate dialogue with groups that refuse dialogue and insist on debate? And I will connect that with, someone gave an example of in a Sunday morning worship service where the social principles were brought up as part of an immigration dialogue, and someone interpreted it as political and left the church. So kind of.
I'm wondering what's going on for them. In other words, I think too often we interpret political as partisan, right? They're not the same thing. The United Methodist Church has always been a political church. We deal with politics in everyday life, where I choose to buy my groceries, where my children go to school, where I live. These are all political decisions. They're conscious or not. They are political decisions. The United Methodist Church does not make decisions based on political realities. We make them based on our values. We make them based on our Wesleyan theology and identity of who God is calling us to be, where God is, and trying to follow that vision, that prophetic vision. So we do this, we do this sometimes stumbling and sometimes very, very directly, but we try to move in a prophetic direction. If that's the case, I don't believe that we ought to be partisan. That's my perspective. I don't think the social principles are partisan. I do believe that they will always be politically engaged. And it is a balance. It is a balance. And I think that we have movements in our country right now. It's not just in the US, but I think it's very present right now in the US, to sort of conflate the two, that there are some religious groups that are so immersed in a political agenda that it's hard to separate God from politics. That's not been the case for the United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church has supported the social gospel for 100 years. That's been part of our tradition. And before that, with Wesley and the evangelical movement in England that gave birth to the Wesleyan churches. That is who we are. We were always engaged politically. To say that we're anti-slavery is a political but a theological statement, isn't it? To say that we believe in gender equality and equity is a political statement, but it's a theological statement, first and foremost. To believe that children have human rights, human dignity, they should be protected. That is not a political statement for me primarily. It's a theological statement with political means to get to that theological goal. So what I like in the social principles in the political section, we don't begin with a definition of politics. We begin with a quote from John Wesley, and it's the quote on love. Now, someone say, well, Neal, what does love have to do with politics? When we were revising this, every team and then our public comment section affirmed this, friends. They affirmed this quote, that this was the appropriate quote to preface what we say about the political community. And I'm only going to read a portion of it. This is what John Wesley said. Love is the fulfilling of the law, the end of the commandment. What is the law? The law is politics, really. Very excellent things are spoken of love. It is the essence, the spirit, the life of all virtue. It is not only the first and great commandment, but is all the commandments in one. All the commandments in one. Whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever things are amiable, honorable. If there's any one virtue, it may be praised. That may be praised. They are all comprised in this one word, love. And so then the first line says, our involvement in political systems is rooted in God's imperative to love our neighbor and to do justice. So if we're going to look at immigration, for example, we can look at it in terms of policy. We could debate it. We could also dialogue around immigration reform, immigration policy. But how does it reflect our ethics around love? How do you measure law with love? And then what has the United Methodist Church said about immigration? Does that reflect a love ethic? Does it reflect a love ethic? It's very appealing to sort of regress back into my partisan position instead of to find, well, where is the love ethic functioning here, friends? That's what the United Methodist Social Principles affirms first. Then we may have different strategies, and there we may be partisan. I admit that. But let's first begin with an agreement that this is the love ethic. Can we do that? And this is why the United Methodist Church has the position it has on immigration. Let's explore that, and let's hear some of the stories around immigration, right? Are we approaching immigration reform and the crisis that we're in right now from an ethic of love? And let's have that conversation. But it is regrettable that folks immediately see this as partisan. But you could say the same thing on every social principle then, couldn't we? That every one of them is partisan. And then where does that leave us? I don't find that very productive. I think there's a better way.
Yeah, it seems that the UMC social principles, they invite us to stay in the tension between the two.
Exactly.
And figure out who God's calling us to be,
yeah,
as disciples of Jesus Christ.
Right? Yeah.
So here's another question. There's a secular opinion that science and religion are enemies. Is that part of the social principles, and has it been updated? Where does that leave the traditional wisdom?
That's a great question. Yeah, so that has been updated, and I'm just looking it up right now. If I can get to the last section appropriately. But we do have language on science that's been updated, and it is, if someone else finds it before me, that's great.
You will find it first, we promise.
It's there. Okay. The rights and freedoms, criminal justice, political science. Here it is. Um, notes there. It's the wisdom language. The balance is yeah, I mean, that's just a good question, because the language does balance traditional wisdom with science, protecting space, caring for all creation. It's here. Food justice, fossil fuels. There it is. I apologize. Found it. All right. Affirming science and traditional wisdom. Okay. This is a short principle. It is updated. We affirm the value of science and reason and provide. And we're living in a climate. This is my opinion, friend. We're living in a climate where science is being denigrated. We have some religious groups that would like to say, well, science is here and our religious interpretation is here, right? And that's what religious nationalism is about. It puts a religious patina, control over things that we ought to be able to have dialogue around. That's not what the United Methodist Church is doing. United Methodist Church, on the contrary to religious nationalism, says this about science and traditional wisdom. We affirm the value of science and reason in providing deeper understandings of the origin and function of the cosmos. We acknowledge that, like all human endeavors, science can be misused and abused. So it's an honest statement. We therefore urge all those involved in scientific investigation to adhere to the highest ethical standards in conducting research and applying findings. So there's got to be some ethical guidance. Now, the question is, what is that ethical guidance? Who's written it? And it'd be interesting to ask practitioners in all fields of science, whether it's biology or physics, what are your ethical standards? And to have that conversation. And if we don't know, then we ask, we find out. We affirm, this is new language though, we affirm the traditional wisdom found in indigenous communities, particularly the emphasis on Native and First Peoples, have placed on living in harmony and balance with the earth and other animals, as well as the need to protect the air, land, and water. So there are at least 3 values that are there, right? That we're saying as United Methodists, we want to reclaim. We want to reclaim. Number 1, that indigenous people have always been part of our church. They're not the other. They are us. They include us. Number 1. Number 2, we need to reclaim and reaffirm the worldview that may come from a more indigenous perspective, which does not prioritize scientific method. It's not either or, but that while science respects scientific method, also respects that there are indigenous ways of viewing the world, and that harmony is the primary value. What does it mean to live in harmony in this world? And then the third thing is protection. So protection of the air, the land, and the water. So when I read that social principle, I think about, okay, what can indigenous communities teach us about science? And we have folks that are all over the place, whether it has to do with vaccines, or whether it is climate change, or whether it is, you name it. We have debates on science now that we may not have had a couple of years ago. This is an opportunity for us as United Methodists to say, okay, yeah, we can debate this, but where's the higher value? Where's the higher value? And then what about other communities that are not represented in the room, like our indigenous siblings? What do they say about this? Well, how would they approach this? What can we learn from them? So the previous social principle was a little bit longer. This is a little more succinct. So there are differences.
Okay.
Yep.
Here's another one. And you spoke a little bit to this, but it has a kind of a nuanced part to it. How does God's imperative to love include disobedience to his prohibitions?
Love to hear more about that and hear what other panelists have to say, how you all would respond to that.
I'm not exactly clear on the question. It might be better if I understood the question before responding. Disobedience to his prohibitions, what does that mean?
I'm assuming, and if that individual wants to put in the chat, if my assumption is inaccurate, I'm assuming that his prohibitions are suggesting that there are prohibitions inherent within the gospel, within the Bible, within the Word of God. And if the imperative to love is in concert with those prohibitions or not, I think.
If I had this just slipped under my office door, like some things are sometimes slipped under the office door, then okay. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I thought there was more. Then for me, I would want to talk with you by yourself, and you can email me on the Wesley website if you want to. But for me, being able to talk about things like this and whether the things in the pamphlet are things we're going to do or not, whether they're things we're going to keep in 4 years or not, being able to have that conversation about what God's imperatives to love wants to do in our world requires that you and I both believe each other when we say that's what we really want to do. I don't know any United Methodists that read the Bible and say, I cannot wait to disobey what God calls me to in this book. And the ways in which we disagree about what that book is calling us to do is that's real and something that we can talk about and figure out together. But it's not a decision that love is more important than obedience, but that love and obedience are both required of us, and we have to be able to figure them out.
I would call, if people have questions about this, because the questioner clarified a little bit, prohibitions against certain things in Leviticus. And so the command to love, and then what do we do with violating what it says in Leviticus? So many things. One, our people need to be taught how to read scripture with integrity.
Mhm.
And that goes across the board, not just about social principles. So understanding particularly some of the Hebrew scripture is important. And I do not think that we clergy do a good enough job of equipping our people to handle scripture responsibly. Second of all, we do have the imperative from Jesus about the commandments, about how to prioritize the commandments. That is not something that we made up in the 21st century. It's not something that we decided to, just be wild people and ignore teachings. Jesus was pretty clear. You love God, you love neighbor. The entirety of the law is brought together in those two commandments. Does that mean that we don't have to struggle with our understanding? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we're all going to land on the same place? Never. But Jesus was clear about the lens that we are to bring to our discussions, to our disagreements, to our priority setting. I don't know how it gets any clearer than that. And it's inconvenient sometimes.
Thank you.
Major, this is
Yes.
Kathy on here.
Yes.
We've got time for one really short question before I drop the the block. Okay.
Okay.
Since
All
that's
right.
my job today.
Okay, I'm going to let Reverend Christie speak to that particular one if he liked, and if not, then maybe I'll
I
make a
think it's
comment.
been said so beautifully already by others
Okay.
that there's not much to add here. I mean, I really am interested in hearing stories. I love hearing people's stories. And when I was in a church in Dallas last Sunday, the senior pastor of that church said, Neal probably doesn't remember I spent a week with him in Washington, D.C. when I was young clergy. And I said, I didn't remember your name, but I remember your face and I remember your story. And so I want to know how people get to the place where how they interpret the scripture and what difference it makes for them. Like, what difference does it make for you? Honestly, that's what I want to know. And I agree with everything the panelists have said so well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And we are cultural beings, and we come to the Word of God with our cultural lenses in full tow. So to imagine that I'm looking at it neutrally is really a bit short-sighted, because I'm coming with all of that baggage, all of my cultural grounding, and interpreting the Word of God. And so part of that makes us see things differently and understand things differently. But I do know that the Word of God says that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So in my worst, whether my worst is behind me or with me now or in front of me, Christ died for me at my worst. And so I'm not throwing any stones. Kathy, let me thank all the panelists for being here and for your willingness to do this. Let me thank the three conferences laity leaders. Four conference laity leaders, and for their willingness to come together and work together and collaborate on this. This was fantastic. I hope we are going to continue this and do some more in-depth and involved opportunities to figure out how we can live into these social principles and bring them to our constituencies in a way that fulfills the law of Christ. So again, thank you, Reverend Christie. This was fantastic. And again, thank you for all your work, and look forward to the book. Make sure if you have an idea for a title, Reverend Christie's looking for a title. So
send it over.
So send it over to him. For this new work. Thank you again for being here and taking time on your Saturday to bless us.
My pleasure.
Kathy, it is yours.
Thank you, Major. And all I can say is, oh my gosh, wow. We are breathing in new spirit, new energies. And hopefully tomorrow morning, as soon as you do communion, talk to your folks at your home church about one point from today, just one. Get the dialogue started so that we can all begin to have this conversation. And then I'm just going to ditto what Major has said. Thank you to our panelists, Cynthia and Neal and Major and Marjorie. You guys are... Please come to my home church. My pastor is sitting here at a watch party, and he says, yes, you can come preach for him. He's waving. That's who I have to do team ministry with. And Mary Nickerson, Janet Allen, Kevin Reed, and myself have had more fun putting this together. So I invite you all to get ready for next spring. We've got an idea and a plan in our heads about what you said yes to. You said yes to a committee. Now what do you do? So we're going to have some leadership information, a leadership webinar for laity and clergy, both, about what to do in all of these committees. So get prepared for that one. And then also, Janet, the resource page, is it in the dialogue? Or I'm sorry, I'm thinking dialogue. There's a resource page in the chat for you to connect with, but of course, Discipleship Ministries has a lot of information here. Reverend Christie just shared a lot of information with us, and just start doing some digging or contact any one of us. We'd be glad to help, or call Kevin. He doesn't do much during the day. So and without any other closing comments, anybody got anything I'm forgetting before I pray us out of here?
Just again, thank you to all of you for organizing this. It's really a gift that you're giving to the church, and many will benefit from this, not just in your jurisdiction, but around the church. So I will make it a point to share this webinar through the United Methodist connection that I have. So thank you.
Well, you know, we're breaking down boundaries, not only our jurisdictional lines, because we share a bishop with another jurisdiction. We're breaking down conference lines. This is true connectional servant leadership, what we are doing. And this is amazing to get to be part of this. So we're amazing. All of us, you're all my favorites. Every one of you. I had to throw that one in. Let us go to God in prayer as we all depart. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you. Thank you with joy in our hearts. Yes, we say yes to you. We say yes to our social principles, to all of our ancestors who have gone before us and laid our path out before us. All we have to do is walk it and say yes. We are grateful for every person that attended this webinar. We are grateful for all of those who did all the Zoom meetings getting this ready. We are grateful to all who have studied and researched and prayed and discerned. But most of all, God, we are grateful for your Son who said, go forth, make disciples, share my word of love, of peace, of grace, and of joy. And in all things, be courageous leaders. Be courageous in all you do. Stand on what we believe. Stand on these principles that we as United Methodists have said yes to. And in all of this, we say, thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for a day and an opportunity to be together. In all things we say, thank you, sweet Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.